Call the member for Forest.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think everybody in this place understands that children are incredibly precious and they have a right to be protected. No child should ever be in a situation where they are sexually assaulted, but we know that that is what's happening. And this amendment, the Sexual Crimes Against Children and Community Protection Measures, adds to the government's recent legislation relating to child sexual abuse. Of course, Carly's Law passed the Parliament in the last session, a law which makes it a crime to plan to harm a child under 16. It targets online predators who misrepresent their age with the sole purpose of grooming the child online for sex. And these people are pretending to be young children, just like the children they are grooming online. The first arrest using this law has already been made. The government also recently passed legislation that stops convicted sex offenders from travelling overseas to commit criminal acts against children in those venues. Now, this bill specifically targets some inadequacies in the criminal justice system that result in outcomes that don't sufficiently punish, deter or rehabilitate offenders. The bill also introduces new offences directed at the use of the internet for the sexual abuse of children. And today I'd really like to acknowledge the member for Fisher, Andrew Wallace, for his Polished Man campaign. It's a campaign encouraging men to take a stand and actively commit to ending violence against children by painting one nail for the month of October. I looked at the statistics provided at this gathering, and the statistics said that more than 120 million girls and 73 million boys have been the victims of sexual violence. I thank Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Minister for Energy and the Environment Josh Frydenberg for their support of this campaign. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government has become increasingly concerned about manifestly inadequate sentences for child sex offenders. These sentences do not sufficiently reflect the harm suffered by the victims of child sex abuse or protect the community from the risk of future harm. These sentences also do not fully reflect the fact that these crimes actually increase the demand for child abuse material, particularly online. And I read, this really concerned me, that since 2012, less than 2/3 of Commonwealth child sex offenders have received a term of imprisonment after conviction. Less than 2/3. This means that 269 child sex offenders convicted of a Commonwealth crime were released directly back into the community over the past 5 years. Well, I find this appalling. Of those who were in prison, the most common sentence length was 18 months and the most common non-parole period was 6 months. Now, I can't think of anyone in my electorate, or any Australian in fact, who would think that these are adequate sentences for those people who sexually abuse children. And I'm a mum, and I just think any mother and father, how would they feel when the person who was convicted under federal law of sexually abusing their child actually served no time in prison? All of us here know how we would feel if it was our child or our grandchild. And I know exactly how I would feel, Mr Deputy Speaker. I know how I would feel. These are vile, heinous crimes. The trust and the vulnerability of children we see every day. We see it in our own children. We see it in every child. I had a group of wonderful children with special needs who came into this Parliament today from Busselton in my electorate. The thought of anybody taking advantage and sexually abusing one of those extremely vulnerable young children, to me, requires the sort of legislation that we're putting here. I don't want to see any person who sexually abuses a child not suffer the punishment that they deserve. And I would suggest there isn't one member of Parliament or one parent or grandparent who wouldn't feel the same. It is absolutely disgusting and abhorrent. And we see these beautiful kids who trust us as adults. They trust us to look after them. And what's love to a child? Love is security. And that's what we are here to provide. And I see my role in this place as providing as much security as I can through the legislation that we enact in this place. And that's why I support the measures within this bill. I agree with the Minister for Justice. Our federal laws should punish and deter offenders unequivocally. It should be a very simple message out into the community. None of us here in any way believe that a sex offender should not be punished. They should be punished, and we should be deterring potential future offenders. And that's why this bill introduces mandatory sentencing for specified offences to address the disparity between the seriousness of child sex offending and lenient sentences. It's critical. The community depends on us to provide the laws as much as is possible to protect the community across the board. Nothing more so than our children. That's what I expect. If I wasn't a member of Parliament here, that's exactly what I would expect of the members in this Parliament and the government of the day. And minimum sentences, mandatory minimum sentences, will send a very clear message. They will apply to the child sex offences that attract the highest penalties. Not just any penalty, the highest penalties. And to reoffenders, as they rightly should. Reoffending, are they one of those 269 who weren't sent to jail as a result, and they've reoffended? What message did they get out of that? If they are reoffending, they clearly have not learnt from the original offence. And I find this that it's applying to the highest penalties. That cannot be understated in this debate. It combats the evolving use of the internet in child sexual abuse. And I know firsthand from young people in my electorate that offenders are using the internet to groom young people for sex. Members here, I'd say most members would be aware I've spoken about it frequently and worked actively in this space. I've seen this as an opportunity for pedophiles. I've delivered hundreds of cyber safety presentations, and the Minister at the table worked with me historically in his previous roles in establishing the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner, focusing on children and specifically providing resources in this space. But I've delivered hundreds of cyber safety presentations to young people, parents and community groups. And following one of these presentations, the mother of an 11-year-old girl contacted my office and said, "My daughter came to your presentation today, and she's come home and she's had to confess to me that she's realised after listening to my presentation that she, at 11, was being groomed online for sex." And it's made even easier with the internet because pedophiles are grooming these children to have sex with them, but they're also encouraging them to meet them in person. And it's extremely disturbing for me, having delivered this to primary school-aged children, to find 8 children in one class of 11-year-olds who had the courage and the honesty to admit to me that they've been to meet people in person that they've only first met online. And I'm continuing to do these presentations. And what disturbs me even more, which is why I'm strongly supportive of this bill, is that it's unusual now for me to come across a class where when I do my secret survey and I ask them if they would be honest about what's happening to them online, and I ask them, have they ever been to meet in person and meet someone they've only first met online? And too often the hands go up. Can you imagine how horrified the teachers are? And can you imagine how horrified the parents are who come along to some of my sessions when I tell them that that's the response that I get? It's not happening to someone else's children. It's happening to our children. So every time I can get to one child, it's a very good day. Every day I can get to a child, and that's what we're trying to do here, is protect those wonderfully innocent, precious children. And I make no excuse for that. I think it's the best thing this government can be doing, and I'm proud of the fact that we take it so seriously. So that concerns me too, that in sentencing for child sex offences, that it needs to be commensurate to the seriousness of the crime, and we are talking about the most serious crimes. And we need to make sure that the sentences imposed adequately reflect the seriousness of the offending that's occurred. And that's important for community trust in us. That's what the community expects of us here. We pass a lot of laws in this place. And some, of course, there's a lot of laws around this space at a state level as well. But when they involve Commonwealth offences, which of course using a carriage service, which is defined, as the Minister knows, using a carriage service, a phone, an iPad, the internet, any form of service to abuse, harass, and of course the sexual abuse is against the law, as it should be. It's a federal offence. And it's also a federal offence. When we see child sexual offences, they're also federal offences in this space. And I'm very pleased that we're introducing the laws here that will make sure that we do everything we can. We are very serious, the government is very serious about ensuring that child sex offenders are off our streets as soon as possible and for as long as possible, especially those who reoffend. And there are a number of measures contained in this bill. Community safety is the primary consideration here. And it means that whether a federal offender's parole should be revoked, and those listening to this speech may find it surprising that community safety is not already the primary consideration. This bill makes it explicit to ensure the protection of the community. It ensures that once an offender's parole has been revoked, they will serve a period of time in custody. That mum, that dad, that grandparent, the brothers and sisters, the friends, that's what they expect us to do. Every child who's sexually abused, their families expect us to have the laws to not only try to protect that child, but then to punish the person who offends. And I'm very pleased that this is the road that we're taking on this. The two new measures is targeting to target especially those online sites. And anyone who's had a bit of a look around the internet and you see the amount of pornography available online and the amount of aggressive physical pornography and some of what's available on the dark web, it's just extraordinary. And it concerns me very greatly about what our children have access to in this space and what they're actually accessing and how young they are when they have access to it. And the second measure, criminalising the transmission of communications to groom any person with the aim of procuring a child for sexual activity. Very, very important. Very, very important, and a measure I'm strongly supportive of. I've just seen too much of it. And it wasn't just an 11-year-old, 13 and 14-year-olds also being groomed online for sex. That came out of a group that I did previously. And we need to make sure that there is harsh punishment. We need to send a very clear message to the offenders and the potential offenders that we as a government and we as a society are not going to stand by and watch more young people being sexually assaulted, our children. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.